The blizzard struck without mercy, turning the mountain into a white grave. A man clawed his way along the cliff face, half blind, fingers numb inside elk-hide gloves, searching for anything that would keep the wind from finishing what it started. His hand found a crack that was not a crack. He lit the lantern with shaking hands. The light revealed what the mountain had hidden for 7 years. Tool marks on granite, iron rails frozen underfoot, wooden crates bearing a name from a life he had buried, and deeper still, a vault door built by men who had planned never to be found. He turned the wheel, metal groaned. Bolts withdrew from stone. The door opened on silence that had waited too long. Inside lay the bones of a boy who had tried, and beside them, a ledger that still remembered every name. The mountain did not care if you lived or died. That was the first thing Elias Cord learned when he went up, not the cold, not the silence. Not the way the wind comes off the high ridges in January and finds every gap in your coat, like it knows exactly where you keep your warmth. Those things he had expected. What he had not expected was the indifference. The mountain did not hate you, did not wish you harm. It simply did not notice you, and after a while, after the first winter, after the second, Elias stopped expecting it to. Stopped expecting anything from the world below the tree line, either. The town, the people, the whole machinery of civilization that grinds on whether you're part of it or not. He had been a part of it once. That felt like someone else's life now. His name was Elias Cord, 48 years old. Gray coming in at the temples and deep in the beard. Hands that told the whole story before he ever opened his mouth. Thick across the knuckles, scarred at the palms. The kind of hands that have worked with metal and rock for so long that they have begun to resemble both. He had been a mining engineer for 23 years. Before that, a blacksmith's apprentice. Before that, a boy in Pennsylvania who thought the West would be the making of him. It had been, just not in the way he imagined. He had come to Colorado Territory in 1865, following the silver boom with the particular optimism of a young man who believes that the combination of intelligence and hard work is sufficient protection against the world's cruelty. He had been right about that, mostly. He had built something, a smithy in Harlan's Crossing, a reputation, a life, and Ruth Whitfield, who became Ruth Cord in the spring of 1868 in a ceremony so small it barely qualified as one. Just the two of them, and the preacher and Domingo Reyes standing in the back because nobody had remembered to tell him it wasn't a public event. And he had simply stayed. Ruth. He did not let himself think her name directly very often anymore. It was like pressing on a bruise. You knew it was there. You knew roughly how bad it was. But pressing on it served nothing except to remind you. She had brown eyes. That was the first thing. Brown eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like what you were saying mattered, even when you knew it probably didn't. She made bread on Sundays. The smell of it, that particular warm, yeasty smell, had a way of finding him even now, 6 years later, 6,000 feet up a mountain, in a cabin where no bread had ever been baked. The smell was not real, he knew that. But it came anyway in the quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking. He did not try to chase it away. It was the only part of her he had left. She had died in January of 1874, fever, the fast kind. The kind that comes in 3 days and leaves nothing behind. Elias had ridden for a doctor. 72 hours, through the worst winter in a decade, pushing his horse past sensible limits, stopping only when the animal needed stopping, eating in the saddle, sleeping in 20-minute increments against fence posts and barn walls. He had reached Harlan's Crossing's only physician, a man named Aldous Price. In the early hours of the third morning, Price had turned him away. Not cruelly, not without apparent regret, but turned away nonetheless, with words about prior commitments and full capacity. The helplessness of a man reciting words someone else had given him. Elias had not understood then. He would understand later. He rode back. Ruth was already gone. He had buried her on a hill, east of town, in the thin January ground that barely permitted the depth required decency. And he'd stood at the graveside for a long time without moving, without praying, without doing much of anything except existing, in the stillness of a man who has run out of next steps. Then he went home, Sold the smithy, sold everything. Bought a mule, a rifle, enough provisions to last the winter, and went up into the Red Rock Ridge Mountains. He did not plan to come back down. That had been 6 years ago. The mule had given out after 2 years. He'd buried her. Her name had been Agnes, a fact he'd also not intended to care about, in a field on the southern slope, and said nothing over the grave. Because he was out of the habit of saying things out loud. He had Sable now. An Appaloosa mare, 11 years old, with a white speckled coat and the steady eyes of an animal that had made its decision about him years ago and saw no reason to revisit it. She watched him with dark intelligence and the quiet patience of something that has chosen its circumstances, and he had Flint. The dog had appeared one April morning 3 years ago. Just appeared, sitting outside the cabin door as if the appointment had been made, and he was simply on time. Black and brown, some variety of hound ancestry, with ears that seemed one size too large for the rest of him, and an expression of permanent mild concern. Elias had left the door open and gone back to his work. By evening, the dog was inside. By the end of the week, the dog had a name, Flint, because the dog was the color of the stone that makes fire. Also because naming the dog anything softer would have felt like an admission of something. His days had a shape now, a specific, deliberate shape that he had constructed over 6 years the way an engineer constructs a structure. Not for beauty, but for load-bearing. For holding up under weight, he was up before light. Not because he had to be. Because sleep in the 6th year was a shallower country than it used to be, and the hours before dawn were the ones most likely to be occupied by things he was not prepared to think about. So it was better to be occupied. He checked his trap line first. 6 traps on the eastern slope, a loop that took 2 hours in good conditions, rabbit mostly, the occasional fox. Enough to supplement the dried goods he hauled up from Red Rock twice a year. A town 14 miles south where nobody asked him questions because word had gotten around that questions were not welcome. He was called the Cord Ghost down there. He knew that. He did not mind it. The ghost of Red Rock Canyon. Because he moved through that mountain country like something that had detached from the living world. Because he was there and then he wasn't. Because people had stopped expecting to see him, and so, when they did, there was that brief irrational jolt of the unexpected. He did not think of himself as a ghost. He thought of himself as a man who had made a decision, a reasonable decision, a survivable one. A decision that had kept him alive for 6 years when the alternative, staying in Harlan's Crossing, among the reminders, among the routine, had not seemed survivable at all. He had not been wrong. He was alive. He just wasn't sure anymore what he was alive, for the cabin he had built in the spring of 1874 was small by anyone's standard. 1 room, a stone fireplace he had mortared himself over 3 weeks, learning as he went, cursing the mortar that wouldn't set properly in the cold nights. A bed frame of rough-hewn pine, a table, 2 shelves, a window on the south wall, facing down into the valley, which he had covered with oilskin in winter, and left open in summer, when the light lasted long enough to make it worthwhile. He had not put in a second chair. He had told himself this was practical. 1 man, 1 chair. But the truth, which he acknowledged in the honest part of his mind that operated late at night when the fire was low, was that putting in a second chair would have been an invitation to something he was not ready to consider. He repaired things. That was how he spent the hours that were not trapping or cooking or sleeping. The cabin had more repairs in it than original construction at this point. New timbers replacing rotted ones, chimney repointed twice. Floorboards relaid in the second winter, when the frost heave had made 3 of them a tripping hazard. An engineer does not live in a deteriorating structure if he has the means to fix it. Offended something fundamental in him. He also made things, small things, practical things. He had the tools for blacksmithing, not a full forge, but a portable bellows kit and a small iron plate that served well enough for light work. He had made hinges for the cabin door when the original ones rusted through, made hooks for the tool wall, made a frame for the oilskin window that fit better than the first attempt. He was good at making things fit. It was, he sometimes thought, about all he was good for anymore. But even that wasn't entirely true, and he knew it. He could read the mountain, could read weather, could read the subtle signs that told you where water ran in summer, and where snow would drift in winter, and where the ground was solid versus where it would give under a horse's weight. He had learned these things the way you learn anything that keeps you alive. Not from books, but from paying the price of ignorance a few times and adjusting accordingly. 6 years. He thought about that sometimes in the abstract way. 6 years was longer than he had worked any single mine job. Longer than most men stayed in one place in the West. Long enough that he had become, without intending it, a kind of landmark, the man on the ridge, the one who'd gone up and not come down, the ghost. He turned 48 in October, alone, with Flint asleep by the fire and Sable, in the corral outside, and the wind doing what the wind did, and the mountains doing what the mountains did. He marked the day by allowing himself a small extra measure of the whiskey he kept for mediating purposes, and by sitting at the table for an hour doing nothing at all, which was the closest thing to celebration he had managed in 6 years. He did not think about the fact that Ruth had always made a small cake for his birthday, even in the lean years. Using whatever they had, he did not think about that. He did not think of himself as a ghost. He thought of himself as a man who had made a decision, a reasonable decision, a survivable one. He was alive. He just wasn't sure anymore what he was alive for. December of 1880 arrived the way December arrives in the high Rockies. Without apology and without warning, even though you have been warned your whole life that this is exactly what it does. Elias had seen the signs on Sunday, a certain color in the western clouds. The way Flint kept circling the cabin rather than ranging out, which the dog did when the dog knew something Elias didn't. The temperature drop, Sunday night, that went past cold into a register that felt like the mountain itself was contracting. He had laid in extra wood, checked his provisions, re-sealed the chimney gaps with the clay and moss mixture he had learned in the second winter to keep on hand. What he had not done was skip the trap line Monday morning. In his defense, and it was a thin defense, the sky at dawn was still that crystalline blue that Colorado does better than anywhere else on Earth. High and cold and clear, the color of something that has been cleaned until it has nothing left to hide. He had looked at that sky and made a calculation. He was wrong. By 9 in the morning, clouds had moved in from the northwest. Not gradually, fast. The way a fire moves when it finds something dry. Not growing but exploding, taking up space it wasn't in a moment before. By 10:30 the first flakes were falling. By 11 he couldn't see 50 yards. By noon he couldn't see 20. He was at the fifth trap, 1 mile from the cabin. In conditions that had turned the familiar slope into a foreign country, every landmark buried or erased or rendered identical to the thing beside it. The wind was from the northwest and building. The temperature, already well below freezing at dawn, had dropped to something that had stopped being merely cold and started being serious. His fingers. That was the first thing. His fingers inside the elk-hide gloves going from cold to numb in the incremental way that the body announces its losses. Then his ears despite the wool cap. Then something deeper, the bone cold. The cold that isn't about surface anymore. He knew better than to panic. Fear kills men in the mountains faster than weather. He stopped, stood still, forced 3 full breaths in through his nose and out through his mouth, and listened to the sound of his own breathing until it was regular. Until the mechanical part of him, the engineer part, the part that had survived 23 years of underground work by refusing to be stupid under pressure, came back online. Assessment. He was 1 mile from the cabin. In zero visibility, walking that mile was as likely to take him off a ledge as home. He had his pack, fire starter, emergency blanket, dried venison, water, a knife, rope, his tool. He had Flint, who was pressed against his leg, with the physical urgency of an animal communicating something important. He needed shelter. He turned slowly, scanning what little he could see through the white chaos. The world had reduced itself to a 20-foot radius of visibility, and within that radius there was snow and more snow, and the vague shapes of pine trees that offered nothing structural. But then, To the east, maybe 40 yards. A darkness in the white that was different from the darkness of trees. More solid, more definite. The gray-black of granite, a cliff face. He didn't remember that formation. But he had also not spent much time on this precise slope in winter conditions. And in a whiteout, the mountain you know becomes the mountain you don't. He moved toward it. 40 yards in a blizzard is not 40 yards. It is a negotiation. Each step sinking 8 inches into the fresh powder. The wind pushing at him from the left. His own sense of direction. Reliable in any other context. Doing that thing where it becomes a debate rather than a certainty. But the cliff face was real. He reached it. Black granite, 60 feet high, slick with ice, angled slightly outward at the base. He moved along it with his right hand trailing the rock, looking for anything, an overhang, a depression. A place where the wind's geometry put him somewhere between the storm and the stone. His hand found nothing. Then it found nothing in a different way. He stopped. He pulled his hand back, looked at the rock face. From straight on it appeared solid, a single, continuous wall. But when he shifted left, changed his angle by 3 feet a gap, 2 feet wide, maybe less. Hidden by the way 2 sections of cliff face had been shaped by the same ancient geologic event that had split them. The overlap making the gap invisible from any angle except this one, at this exact position, in this exact light. He pulled out his lantern, struck the flint 3 times before his numb fingers cooperated. The flame caught. He aimed the light into the gap. The light went in, did not come back, not reflecting off a back wall, disappearing into a space too large for the beam to find the far end of. He looked back at the storm. He looked at the gap. He went in. The change was immediate. Wind, gone, not warm. The temperature inside was still well below freezing, but the wind was gone, and without wind, cold is a different thing. Manageable, endurable. The difference between weather and situation. He moved through the narrow entrance sideways, pack scraping both walls, and came out into a chamber that opened up like an exhale wide. Very wide. The lantern beam swept, left, then right, and found nothing definite at the edges. He was standing in a space at least 15 feet across, with a ceiling that rose up and angled back and disappeared. The walls were not bare rock. They were covered in ice formations, layered ice. The kind built up over many decades of seeping water and freezing, pale blue and white and gray. Catching the lantern light and sending it back changed. Icicles hanging from the ceiling like a chandelier in a house that had been abandoned and then reclaimed by the mountain itself. Beautiful. Lotz noted this without being moved by it. He was past the stage of being moved by beautiful things for their own sake. Beautiful was fine. Useful was what he needed. He moved the lantern more carefully, systematic. The engineer's sweep, not looking for impressions but for information. The floor, hard packed, ice over rock. Nothing soft, no collapse risk. The ceiling, solid. The ice formations were old and stable, not the fresh accumulation that could come down. The walls. He stopped. He held the lantern closer to the left wall. The stone beneath the ice was marked, not by water, not by the random carving of geological time. These marks were deliberate, parallel lines, grid patterns. The specific geometry of human intention applied to rock soul marks, pick and chisel work, regular and purposeful, the kind made by men who knew what they were doing. He looked at the floor again, really looked there. Under a crust of ice, a seam, straight and regular, not a natural crack, a track. He knelt and brushed ice from it with his gloved hand. Iron, a rail, part of a track system. He stood, he moved deeper. The cave bent left after about 30 feet and opened into a passage that narrowed before widening again. He moved carefully, lantern forward, flint close at his heels. The dog unusually quiet, unusually tense, which Elias noticed, the way he noticed all of the dog's communications now. Having learned to trust them, more track, more tool marks. A rusted pulley assembly against the right wall, so corroded it had essentially become part of the rock. Fragments of old rope, crumbling at the touch, barely rope anymore, just the ghost of rope, the shape of it preserved in the dry underground air, a wooden crate. Then another. He moved the lantern to the nearest crate and brushed ice from the surface. Stenciling, faded but readable. Harlan's Crossing Silver Works, property of HCSW. 1873, he stood still for a long moment. Harlan's Crossing, his town, his former town. The town he had not entered in 6 years and had not thought about if he could help it. This mine was not on any map he had ever seen. In his years as a mining engineer, and he had seen most of the operating claims in this territory, he had never heard of a Harlan's Crossing silver operation at this elevation, on this face of the ridge. Which meant one of two things. Either this was a small private claim that never got registered, worked briefly and abandoned, or this was a claim that had been deliberately kept off the records. He thought about the quality of the construction, the iron door track, the pulley system, the reinforced passage. This was not amateur work. This was not a prospector with a pick and too much optimism. This was a professional operation, built by men who knew what they were building, and deliberately hidden. He moved further in. The passage opened again. Second chamber, larger. The ceiling above his lantern beam, lost in the darkness above, which meant height, real height, 20, 25 feet, maybe more. And on the far wall, he stopped, held the lantern higher, a door, iron. Heavy gauge. Mounted flush into the rock with a precision that spoke of serious engineering, not just a door but a designed integration of door and stone. The frame cut specifically for this opening, set with bolts that went deep into the granite. The door was covered in ice, layered ice, built up unevenly over many years. In the center of the door, a wheel mechanism, the kind that operates internal bolts. Multiple bolts from the look of the mechanism's size. This was not a mine storage door. Elias had seen vault doors in banks, in territorial government buildings. Once, in a military installation in Denver that he had contracted work for in '71. This was a vault door, built into a mountain, hidden behind a concealed entrance, at the end of a secret mine shaft that didn't appear on any official record. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Flint had stopped moving entirely. Sat. Stared at the door with those two large ears forward, with an expression of concentrated animal attention that the dog reserved for things worth paying attention to. Elias put his pack down. He pulled out his knife and started chipping ice. It took a long time. The ice was old. Not the fresh accumulation of 1 or 2 winters, but the built-up layering of many, 6, 7, possibly more years of seeping water freezing in strata. He worked methodically, the way you work when you know. The work will take, however long it takes, and impatience does nothing but waste energy. He built a fire against the base of the door. Small but focused, dry wood fragments from his pack. Some of the ancient rope material that was desiccated enough to catch. The heat worked faster than chipping alone. The ice came off in sheets where the fire had worked on it, in chips and fragments where his knife had to do the work. While the fire worked, he explored the outer chamber more thoroughly. More crates. He opened the ones he could access. Burlap bags, empty, or with traces of what had been grain. Empty metal containers, a rusted lantern older than his, and in the far corner, wedged between 2 crates, a canvas bag. Sealed with a wax seal cracked with age but intact. He opened it carefully. Inside was a ledger, a proper accountant's ledger, bound in brown cloth, the pages, protected by the canvas and the wax, still intact. He opened the cover. Harlan's Crossing Silver Works, labor accounts. March 1873 through April 1873. His hands were not quite steady as he turned the pages. Conloms, names on the left, hours in the middle, wages due on the right. 140 entries, written in a small, careful hand that spoke of someone who took the recording seriously. Irish names, Spanish names, Chinese names romanized into the alphabet. A scattering of others, 140 men, their hours documented to the quarter hour, their wages calculated at the agreed rate, each row ending in a final column, balance owing, not paid, not closed, balance owing. Every single entry, 140 rows. Balance owing. The total at the bottom of the last page. He read the number twice, $22,480 in $1,873, which was not a small number then, and was not a small number now. He closed the ledger. Put it back in the canvas bag. Put the bag in his own pack. His fire had been working for 40 minutes. He went back to the vault door, and test the wheel mechanism with his bare hand through the glove. Warm to the touch, he grabbed it. He had opened seized mechanisms before. Underground, when equipment fails, you do not call for a replacement. You fix what you have with what you have. He had freed rusted bolts in collapsed shafts, freed jammed valve systems in flooded passages, freed lock mechanisms on equipment that had been underwater for 3 days, and should not have functioned again. The method is the same in all cases. You don't force. Force breaks. You persuade. Small movements. Consistent pressure. A little. A fraction. Then more, then back. Then more again. Not fighting the mechanism, but in conversation with it. Finding the point of least resistance and working outward from there. He worked the wheel. Back. Forward. Back. Forward. For 20 minutes, nothing. His shoulders were burning. His hands, the gloves now off. Because you need to feel this kind of work. Were bleeding at the knuckle from the wheel's edge. Then, a quarter inch, he felt it before he heard it. The faintest movement. Metal on metal, protesting but not refusing. He kept going. The quarter inch became a half inch. The half inch became a full degree of rotation. The mechanism groaned, a deep iron sound that resonated through the rock and up through the floor and into his feet. He kept going, full rotation. Then, another. On the third rotation, something internal shifted. He could hear it, feel it, through the wheel. The heavy motion of bolts withdrawing from their housings in the stone. He pulled the handle, the door swung open, slowly, heavily. The sound it made was not dramatic. Just the low exhalation of a sealed space releasing pressure. A breath held for years, finally let go. He stood in the opening, held the lantern high. The room beyond was not natural. Someone had carved it from the bedrock and finished it. Timber supports at the corners and along the ceiling. Dry stone infill on 3 walls. A packed earth floor, hard as concrete with age, 12, 15 feet, maybe slightly more. And in that space, boxes, iron strong boxes. 14 of them stacked on wooden pallets. The pallets rotted at the edges but still structurally sound. He moved forward, opened the first box with the tool in his pack, designed for this kind of latch, silver bars, stamped, dated, HCSW, 1873, he counted. 20 bars in the first box, he lifted one, 8 pounds, roughly. Pure grade silver, he set it down and opened the second box. More bars, and something else, canvas bags, similar to the one that had held the ledger. He opened one. Coins, gold and silver, minted in the late 1860s and early 70s. He opened another, paper currency U.S. banknotes, in a sealed oilskin that had kept them dry and intact. Third box, more coins, and something wrapped in oilskin. A stack of documents. He opened it carefully. Property deeds. Stock certificates dated 1872 and 1873. Financial instruments of various kinds. He moved through the room, box by box, not counting, not calculating. That would come later. Right now, he was simply taking in the scale of what he was seeing, which was considerable. This was not a prospector's savings. This was not the hoarded wealth of a small man with small ambitions. This was a systematic accumulation, organized, categorized, deliberately preserved. Someone had planned to keep this for a long time and had engineered the storage accordingly. Someone had stolen all of this and had never moved it. 7 years. Whatever had kept it here. Fear of detection. Loss of the means to access it. Some other complication. It had sat in this mountain for 7 years. He reached the back corner and stopped. There was a sleeping roll. What remained of one. The canvas had rotted partially away. The wool blanket inside compressed and damp, damaged and gray. But the shape of it was clear. Something was inside the sleeping roll. He already knew what it was before he moved the lantern closer. Bones. A skeleton, largely intact. Still partially clothed. The fabric of what had been a work shirt and canvas trousers, mostly gone but visible, at the larger pieces, the collar, the waistband. One hand was extended slightly beyond the edge of the sleeping roll, holding something. Elias crouched down, in the bony curl of the extended hand, a piece of paper, folded, preserved by the dry underground air, far better than the clothing or the canvas. He extracted it gently. He opened it. The writing was in pencil, in a hand different from the ledger, faster, less careful. The writing of a man working quickly, or with failing strength, or both. If you find this, I am Tomas Reyes. I followed Mercer, here from Harlan's Crossing in November 1873. He shot me at the door. I have been here since. I cannot stand up anymore. The cold is helping, I think. Slower. The list I copied from the payroll book is folded inside the back cover of this Bible. Take it. It has all names and all amounts owed. 140 men. Mercer took everything from them. My father's name is Domingo Reyes. He lives near Harlan's Crossing. Please tell him I did not run away. Please tell him I tried. Elias read the note twice. Then he sat down on the nearest crate and looked at the bones of Tomas Reyes for a long time. The lantern flame was steady in the still underground air. No wind to disturb it. Just the light and the room, and the bones of a man who had tried. There was a Bible. Small. Leather-covered. Sitting against the wall behind where Tomas had lain, as if he had placed it there deliberately before lying down. Or as if it had fallen from his hands in the last moments. Elias reached for it, old. The leather was dry and cracked, but the binding held. He opened to the inside back cover, a piece of folded paper. Smaller than the note, dense with writing on both sides. The same pencil hand, but here more careful, more deliberate. A list, names written in small precise letters. Next to each name, an amount, dollar figures. And at the bottom, a total 22,480. Total wages owed as of April 1, 1873. Witnessed by T. Reyes, it matched the ledger, 140 names. One list by the man who kept the official records. One copy by the man who followed him here and died for the evidence. Elias folded the paper back inside the Bible. He put the Bible in his pack, alongside the ledger. He built a fire in the outer chamber, a real one this time. Not the small controlled heat he'd used on the vault door, but a proper fire, using the ancient timber fragments from the mine equipment that were dry enough to catch. The smoke vented somewhere. He could feel the draft. That meant the cave connected to the surface higher up. He would not suffocate. He ate. Dried venison and hard biscuit from his pack. Flint got the last of the venison scraps and lay against his legs and provided warmth in the uncomplicated way that dogs provide warmth. Outside, the storm continued. The sound of it came through the rock as a low vibration, the mountain registering its displeasure in its own frequency. He had been in enough bad situations to know that this one, being stuck in a cave overnight in a mountain blizzard, was not actually that bad. He had shelter, he had fire, he had food. He was in no immediate danger. The danger was more abstract. 14 miles south, in the town of Harlan's Crossing, there was a man named Augustin Mercer. He knew this name. He knew this name the way you know a name you heard once and put aside, and then encounter again in a different context, and suddenly the context makes everything about the name different. He had heard it, over the years, in the limited conversations he had allowed himself in Red Rock's general store. Mercer. The banker, the man who had built Harlan's Crossing into something from nothing, generous, substantial. The kind of man a frontier town consolidates around. The kind of man who ends up on the town council, who gives money to the church, who organizes the cattle association and the mining claims office and the string of institutions that add up to civilization. The kind of man no one questions, because who questions a foundation? But foundations can be built on anything, even stolen silver. Even the wages of 140 men who worked and were told the money was coming. Omaiden. And then were told the mine was finished, and then watched the man who owed them disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of a territory that had better things to do than track one missing payroll. He thought about the ledger in his pack. 140 entries, 140 names. He thought about Domingo Reyes. Please tell him I did not run away. Somewhere in the dark near Harlan's Crossing, a man named Domingo Reyes had spent 7 years not knowing where his son was. He did not sleep for a long time. He lay in his bedroll with Flint against his back, and the fire dying down to coals, and the storm doing what the storm did outside, and he thought about choices. He could stay. Go back to the cabin. Pretend he had never found this place. The thought arrived, and he examined it honestly, the way he examined all thoughts. He was not at base a dishonest man, even with himself, especially with himself. He had tried dishonesty with himself once. After Ruth died, he had tried telling himself it was all right, that he was all right, that going up the mountain was a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, rather than the spectacular flight from everything that it actually was. That had not worked. So, he examined the thought honestly. He could walk away. Take nothing. Leave the door open or close it. Leave the bones of Tomas Reyes where they lay. Leave the ledger and the Bible and the silver, and all of it to the mountain's keeping. Return to his cabin. His traps. His silence. No one would know. The thought was not without appeal. He was not going to pretend otherwise. He had worked very hard to build a life that required nothing of him, that asked nothing, that expected nothing. Going down meant people. People meant questions. Questions meant a life he had spent 6 years carefully taking apart, piece by piece, being reassembled around him whether he wanted it or not. But then he thought about Tomas Reyes, 20 years old maybe. Younger? Hard to say, but young. Young enough to follow a man into the mountains for justice. Young enough to believe that finding the evidence was the same as finding the solution. Young enough to die for the attempt and spend his last hours writing a note to make sure the attempt wasn't wasted. Please tell him I did not run away. Not, please get the money back. Not, please find Mercer. The last thing Tomas Reyes had wanted, dying in a mountain vault in the winter of 1873, was for his father to know that he had not run. Elias thought about Ruth. Not sideways, directly, which was not something he did very often, and which cost him something each time. Ruth, who had believed in fairness with a simplicity that he had sometimes, in his more cynical moments, found almost naive. Ruth, who had said once, they were arguing about some dispute in the mining community. He couldn't remember the specifics, that the trouble with powerful men was not that they were cruel, it was that they were comfortable. And comfortable men, she had said, do not notice what their comfort costs other people. She would not have been able to walk away from this. She would have looked at him with those brown eyes and not said a single word, because she would not have needed to. I know, he thought. I know. He lay in the dark a while longer. Then he closed his eyes. He would sleep. He would let the storm pass. He would take stock in the morning. And in the morning, when the blizzard had burned itself out and the sky had gone back to that impossible Colorado blue, he would make his decision. He already knew what it was. He woke before first light, which was his habit. The fire had gone to ash. The cave was cold in a deep, settled way that had none of the violence of the storm outside. Still cold, but patient. Elias lay still for a moment, taking stock. His hands were stiff. His shoulder from where he'd worked, the vault wheel, was going to make itself known for the next several days. He got up, built the fire back from coals and a fresh piece of timber, made coffee, real coffee, which he rationed carefully and which this situation seemed to warrant. He sat with the cup and the fire, and Flint and thought. The storm was over. He could feel it in the air quality, the pressure difference, and the sound, the deep vibration that had been the storm's constant undertone, was gone, replaced by the specific silence that comes after weather in the mountains, the silence of everything being still, waiting. He went to the vault room one more time. He stood in the doorway and looked at everything inside it, with the measuring eye of the engineer he had been, the silver, the gold and coinage, the paper currency, the financial instruments. His rough calculation from the night before, conservatively, put the current value at something considerably larger than the $22,480 in unpaid wages. Silver prices had moved since '73. Gold was gold. The paper instruments, some of them had appreciated. He was not going to take any of it. He already knew that. He stood in the vault room and looked at the strong boxes and let the knowing settle completely. The way you let a decision when it has been made at the level below conscious thought and simply needs to be acknowledged by the rest of you. He had asked himself, sometime in the night, whether he was being principled or foolish, whether there was a version of this, where what he needed, a bar or two, enough to live on for several years, and still reported the rest. A partial taking that harmed no one materially, given the scale of what was here, He had examined that argument with the same honest care he gave all of his thoughts, and he had found that it dissolved under examination. Not because the ethics were complicated. They weren't. This money had names on it. 140 sets of them. Taking any of it, for any reason, was the same theft in miniature that Mercer had committed in full. The scale was different. The principle was identical. And beyond the principle, the practicality. If he arrived in Harlan's Crossing with money from this vault, he would have no moral standing to demand accountability for the man who had taken the rest. He would simply be another thief. And a smaller one. He would be Mercer, with better intentions and less capital. No, he looked at the bones of Tomas Reyes in the corner. "I'll come back for you," he said. His voice was rough from disuse and the dry underground air. He said it anyway. Some things needed to be said out loud even when the only witness was a skeleton and a dog. He pulled the vault door closed. He did not lock it. He did not see the point. Anyone who found this place could open it. Anyone who could find this entrance, in this cliff face, at this angle, they'd earned whatever they found inside. He put on his pack. He called Flint. He went back out into the world. The light was extraordinary. That was the thing about after a blizzard, up here at this elevation. The storm scoured the air clean of everything. Every particle of dust, every haze, every interference between your eyes and the distance. And then the sun came up on all that fresh snow, and the world became something that didn't seem like it should exist. Too bright, too clear, too exact. He stood at the cave entrance for a long moment. He could see the valley below, far below. White and still, the creek invisible under ice, the pines along its banks heavy with accumulated snow. And further, much further, at the limit of the clean winter visibility, a smudge that might be smoke. Might be the early morning fires of a settlement. Harlan's Crossing, 14 miles, in his current physical condition, in current snow conditions, on foot, a long day, on Sable. Who was stabled in the cabin another 2 miles north, 8 hours, maybe less. If the snow was consolidated enough for decent footing, he thought about what waited there. Augustin Mercer, 62 years old, banker, town council, pillar, the man who had built a second life on the wages of 140 workers, and had been building it quietly, right there, in the same town where some of those workers still lived, a sheriff named Clem Hargrove who had, if the evidence, in that vault held up and involved in keeping this buried, and somewhere at the edge of town. An old man named Domingo Reyes, who did not know where his son was, who had been not knowing for 7 years. Elias picked up his rifle and checked the load, put it on his shoulder. He turned north, toward the cabin, toward Sable. He had not been to Harlan's Crossing in 6 years. He was going now, not because it was easy, because Tomas Reyes had tried, and because Ruth, with those brown eyes and that particular way of not saying anything while saying everything, would not have been able to look at him if he didn't. Neither, honestly, could he. The mountain watched him go, indifferent as always. But he was done mistaking indifference for permission. He walked. Harlan's Crossing looked exactly like a lie. That was the first thing Elias thought when he rode in. Not that it looked bad. It didn't. It looked prosperous, settled. The kind of town that has decided it is permanent and has begun building accordingly. Plank sidewalks on both sides of Main Street. A proper hotel with a painted sign. A bank with stone facing on the lower half of the building. A church with a real bell tower. A schoolhouse. A telegraph office. All of it neat. All of it solid. All of it built, he now knew, on a foundation that would not bear examination. He had not been here in 6 years. 6 years ago, this had been a smaller place. Rougher. More provisional. The kind of frontier settlement that might have become something, or might have blown away in a dry summer, and nobody was entirely sure which. Now it had made its decision. It had become something, and the man who had made that possible was somewhere in one of these buildings, going about his morning as if the bones of a boy he had shot were not sitting in a mountain vault 14 miles north. Elias rode slowly. He did not look around the way a man does when he is trying to appear casual. Casual looking is its own signal. He just rode, straight-backed, at Sable's steady pace. Eyes forward with the kind of deliberate inattention that mountain living teaches you. How to be present without a nothing. Flint trotted at Sable's heels. The town registered them without particular interest. A man on a horse with a dog. December in Colorado. Nothing remarkable good. He stabled Sable at the livery on the east end of Main Street. The liveryman was a young man he did not recognize, which was fine. After 6 years, most of the faces would have changed. People move in, people move out. A frontier town's population turns over like weather. Staying long? The liveryman asked. Few days, Elias said. $1.50 a night, feed included. Fine. He paid without discussion and left Sable in a clean stall with fresh hay, which the horse accepted with the dignified pleasure of an animal who has spent the last 2 days in post-blizzard conditions and has opinions about that. He got a room at the hotel, small, cold. A bed, a washstand, a window that looked out on the alley. He did not need more than that. He set his pack down. He put the canvas bag with the ledger under the floorboard beneath the bed, which was loose. He had checked before committing to the room. He sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the order of operations. He needed Domingo Reyes. The old man was the living bridge between the crime and the evidence. He had worked at the mine. He had known the workers. He had known. Tomas's note made this clear, what Mercer had done. And most importantly, he might know things that were not in the ledger, and not in Tomas's note, context, names, the specific mechanics of how Mercer had managed to steal everything and walk away clean. But Domingo, according to Tomas's note, had been hiding near Harlan's Crossing since 1873. 7 years of hiding meant 7 years of learning to be invisible. Which meant you didn't find Domingo Reyes by asking around. Because asking around was exactly how you'd announce to Mercer that someone was looking for the one man in County who could put him at the center of this. So not asking around, he needed a different approach. He went to the general store, not for information, for supplies genuinely. He needed a few things, and for the intelligence that comes from simply being present in a place where people talk without thinking about whether anyone is listening. The storekeeper was a woman in her 50s. Sharp eyes behind spectacles. The kind of person who has been in the same store for 15 years and knows every piece of information that has passed through the door. Her name, he learned from the sign outside, was Mrs. Adeline Foss. He bought coffee, hardtack, rifle cartridges, small purchases. The kind that don't require conversation but permit it. Mrs. Foss permitted it. Haven't seen you before, she said. Without making it a question. Just through, he said. Terrible weather for travel, it was. He counted out coins. Town's grown? It has. She packed his items with the efficiency of long practice. Mr. Mercer has been good for this area. Banks brought investment. Brings money. Investment brings businesses. Businesses bring people. She said it the way people say things about foundations. Settled. Obvious. The bank on the corner? Elias said. First Territorial of Harlan's Crossing. Mr. Mercer's been running it going on 6 years now. Before that, he had business interests elsewhere in the territory. She handed him his package. You looking for work? There's always need for skilled men. I'm a smith. By trade, is that so? Her eyes assessed him with new interest. Old Hendricks had the smithy, but he passed in October. Place is sitting empty. Elias said nothing to that. Filed it. There a doctor in town, he said. Dr. Price. Office is 2 blocks east, above the apothecary. He nodded. He took his package. He left. He walked the town instead of going to Price. One full circuit, slow, observational. He was looking for patterns, the architecture of daily life in Harlan's Crossing, where people gathered, where they avoided. The rhythms that tell you how power moves through a place. The bank was the center. That was obvious after 20 minutes. Not just financially, socially. The men who came out of that building walked differently than the men who went in. A fractional degree, more upright, more certain. As if their encounter with Mercer's institution had confirmed something about their standing. Money does that, or rather, the people who control money do that. The effect is the same whether it's earned or stolen. The sheriff's office was diagonally across from the bank, close enough for a man at the bank's window to watch the front door. close enough for the sheriff to see who came and went from the bank. The geometry of it was not accidental. Sheriff Hargrove, he saw the man twice in his circuit, big, late 40s, the physical presence of someone who has used his size as currency for so long that it has become identity. He moved through Main Street with the proprietary ease of someone who considers the whole street his hallway. He did not look at Elias specifically, but he looked at everything in the general way of a man who has learned that knowing what's in front of him is how he keeps his position. Elias made a note, not on paper, in the part of his mind that had learned, over 23 years underground, to track hazards. Hargrove was a hazard. He also noted the telegraph office, small building next to the post office, hand-painted hours on the window. A young man inside, he could see through the glass, working the machine with the bored efficiency of someone who has done this so many times the movements have become involuntary. He noted the alley behind the hotel that connected south to the Creek Road, the width of it, whether it was watched. It was not watched. He noted the jail, the way it sat at an angle to the main street that put its back wall in shadow for most of the afternoon. He noted this not because he planned to need the information, but because an engineer in an unfamiliar structure notes the points of potential failure without being asked. He walked the circuit twice. On the second pass coming south along the main street, he almost walked directly into Augustin Mercer. It was not staged. He was certain of that. Later, the timing was wrong for staging. And Mercer's expression in the first half-second, before he controlled it, was genuine surprise, which was, in its own way, more informative than anything staged would have been. Because what Elias saw in that half-second was not a guilty man afraid of being caught. It was a powerful man surprised to find an unknown variable standing directly in front of him. Mercer recovered fast. "Good morning," Mercer said. Warm, practiced. The professional warmth of a man who has made warmth a business tool. "Morning," Elias said. He looked at Mercer, 62 years old, silver-haired, the body of a man who had been physically strong in younger years and had transitioned that into presence rather than effort. Well-dressed for a frontier town. Not ostentatiously, but in the way that signals, "I can afford this," without requiring you to comment on it. The eyes were the thing. Elias was good at eyes, had been for a long time. And what he saw in Augustin Mercer's eyes, once the surprise cleared, was a calculation running. Fast and clean, the way a practiced card player reads a table, not obvious, but present. Mercer was looking at him and asking himself, "Who is this, and what does he know?" "Just arriving," Mercer said. "Few days now," Elias said. "Cord, isn't it?" Mercer said. "I heard a Mr. Cord had come through. I make it a point to know who's in town." "Habit, I'd imagine," Elias said. A pause. Brief. The length of a breath. "Well," Mercer said, "if you need anything while you're in Harlan's Crossing, banking, letters of introduction, business, contacts, my door is always open." "I'll keep that in mind," Elias said. They parted. Elias kept walking. He did not look back, but he knew Mercer had not moved yet. Could feel it, the way you can feel, underground, when a shift is happening in the rock behind you. Before it announces itself audibly, Mercer was standing on that sidewalk, watching him walk away, running the calculation. Fine, let him calculate. The evidence was already in motion. Or, would be shortly. The edges of town were where he found what he was actually looking for. Not Domingo, not yet, but signs of Domingo. There was a way that certain people live in small towns when they are afraid, but cannot leave. They occupy the peripheral spaces, the alley behind the laundry, the woodpile at the back of the church, the road that goes south out of town toward the creek, where a man might have a small piece of land that the town proper doesn't think about. He had lived peripherally himself for 6 years. He knew the signs. The small cabin at the south end of the Creek Road had a garden, winter dead now, but tended even in December, the protective straw mounding around the root vegetables still fresh, the fencing recently repaired. Someone who lived here cared about continuity, about next spring. Someone who intended to still be here next spring. A light in the window. Small, careful. The light of someone who has learned not to advertise. He did not go to the door. Not yet, not without thinking it through. Because walking up to a man who has been hiding for 7 years and saying, "I found your son," was not something you did without preparation. He sat on a creek rock 50 yards from the cabin and thought about it for a long time. Flint sat beside him and watched the cabman with those two large ears, and communicated nothing except his usual expression of mild professional concern. "I know," Elias said. The dog twitched one ear. "I know," he said again. He went back to town. He went to find Dr. Aldous Price. This was the part he had been avoiding. Not consciously, he was honest enough to catch himself at that. He had been telling himself he was saving Price for the right moment, for when he had more information, for when the approach was clear. All of which was true, technically. But also, Price was the man who had turned him away. January of 1874. 3 in the morning. A man who had ridden 72 hours and was asking for help for his dying wife, and Price had said no. He had carried that no for 6 years. Now he was going to knock on the man's door, because Ruth deserved the truth about why she died even more than Elias deserved to stay away from it. The office above the apothecary had a separate entrance, a door at the top of a narrow staircase on the building side pod, a hand-painted sign on the door, A. Price, M.D. Hours, 8:12-2:5. He knocked. A long pause. Then shuffling. Then the door opened. Aldous Price was 60 years old and looked it. The kind of 60 that comes from sustained guilt rather than sustained age. The body carrying something that doesn't photograph as visible weight, but that you can see in the set of the shoulders, in the quality of attention behind the eyes. He had gray hair, mostly gone now at the temples. He had the pallor of a man who drinks enough to function, but not enough to stop. He looked at Elias without recognition. 6 years, a beard, different clothes. Elias was not the same man who had come to that door, yes? Price said. "My name is Elias Cord." He said, "You knew me once. I need to talk to you about 1874. Price's face did something complicated. A rapid sequence, blankness, then searching, then the thing that happens when a memory arrives that you have been hoping would not. His hand on the doorframe tightened. "You'd better come in," he said. And his voice was the voice of a man who has been waiting for this knock for 6 years and is almost relieved it has finally arrived. The office was small and smelled of carbolic and old paper. 2 chairs, a desk with a medical bag on it that suggested Price still practiced, though the bag was dusty at the clasp. A window looking out on the alley. A bottle of whiskey on the shelf, 2/3 empty, which told the same story the pallor told. Price poured himself a glass without offering one. Then he looked at the glass. "Pushed it aside, Cord," he said. "Ruth Cord." "Yes." "January of 74. Yes." Price looked at his hands. Physician's hands. Still steady, Elias noted. Whatever the man was carrying, it had not yet taken his hands. "I have thought about your wife every single day for 6 years, Price said. Not what Elias had expected. "Tell me," Elias said, and Price told him. The medicine had existed. That was the first thing. That was the thing that had lived in the back of Elias's mind as a question for 6 years. Had the medicine even existed? Or was he blaming a man for not providing what wasn't there to provide? It had existed. A quinine-based fever treatment, not common in rural Colorado in 1874, but not unknown. Price had obtained a supply in the fall of 73 specifically for the winter sickness season. He had enough to treat 12 patients. He had enough to treat Ruth. "Then why?" Elias said, and his voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who has decided to hear the whole thing before he decides what to do with it. Price looked at the pushed-aside whiskey glass. "Mercer," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. "Augustin Mercer had been financing my practice for 3 years," Price said. "When I came here in 71, I had no capital. Equipment, supplies, the space, it all requires money. He provided it. At terms that seemed reasonable at the time and became less reasonable as they accumulated." He stopped. Breathed. "By 73 he owned my practice. Not officially, not on paper, but in every way that mattered. He had decisions over who I treated, over what I charged, over what services I extended to which patients." Elias said nothing. He had told me that autumn. Price said that miners' families, former miners, by then the Copper Ridge operation was done. were not to receive credit treatment. Cash only. Full rate. No exceptions. He swallowed. He said it was a business decision. That bad debts were threatening the practice's viability. That I needed to think about sustainability. He stopped again. Your wife came to me 2 weeks before you did, Price said. The room went very still. She was showing early symptoms. Fever. I could have treated her then, when it was manageable. She said you would pay when the winter work was done, that you had the money coming. She was not asking for charity. She was asking for credit of 4 weeks. He looked at his hands. I turned her away. Mercer's terms. I turned her away. Elias sat with that for a long time. The room was very quiet. Outside, Harlan's Crossing went about its morning. By the time you came to me, Price said, it was too late. And I knew it was too late. And I could not tell you why. His voice had gone rough. I have told myself every day since that I could have refused him. That I could have treated her anyway. That the practice was mine, and my obligation was to my patients, and no financial arrangement changes that. He looked at Elias directly. I could have. I didn't. Silence. Why are you telling me this now? Elias said. Because you came and asked, Price said, and I am very tired of the alternative. He left Price's office and stood in the alley for a long moment. The cold was immediate, sharp. The kind of sharp that clarifies. Ruth had gone to Price 2 weeks before she died. Early symptoms, treatable. A 4-week credit on the medicine. No, kind of arrangement that any reasonable man in any reasonable town would have made without a second thought. Mercer had made it impossible, not by shooting anyone. Not by standing in a doorway with a weapon. Just by owning enough of the machinery of daily life in Harlan's Crossing, that the machinery could be aimed at whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted, for whatever reason, served his interests. Ruth had died because Mercer controlled the doctor. The miners had lost their wages because Mercer controlled the mine. Tomas Reyes had died in a vault because Mercer controlled who knew what and what happened to the people who found out. A pattern, not passion, not rage, not even malice, exactly, just the patient, systematic use of financial leverage to make sure that nothing in this town moved without Mercer's permission, including medicine, including Ruth. Elias stood in the alley until his hands stopped doing the thing they wanted to do, which was find something they could do that would be useful and immediate, and probably inadvisable. Then he breathed. Then he thought. Anger was not the tool for this. He knew what anger did to a man's judgment. He had watched it happen to other men underground, in collapsed shafts and flooded passages, when the difference between surviving and dying was the difference between thinking clearly and thinking furiously. Ferry feels like power. It is the opposite of power. He breathed out and went to find Domingo Reyes. He took the creek road south. The afternoon light was already angling low. December in the Rockies meant a short day, and he had used most of it. The snow on the road was compacted by previous traffic, but not icy. Flint ranged ahead, then circled back, then ranged ahead again, in the pattern that meant the dog was happy to be moving. The cabin at the end of the road looked different in afternoon light, smaller. More provisional. The garden more clearly the work of one pair of old hands. Doing what they could with what they had. He knocked. Silence, then. Who is it? Not a question. A statement. The voice of someone who has learned that questions invite conversation, and conversation is how you get found. My name is Elias Cord, he said. I lived on Red Rock Ridge for 6 years. I found something on the mountain that belongs to you. Silence. Longer this time. Then the sound of a bar being lifted. The door opened 3 inches. One eye, dark, old, carrying 7 years of something that did not have a simple name, looked out at him. What did you find, Hind? The voice said. Your son wrote a note, Elias said carefully. He wanted you to know that he didn't run away. The door opened. Domingo Reyes was 71 years old. He was not a large man, had probably never been, in the way that certain men are built for endurance rather than size. Thin but not fragile. The kind of thinness that comes from decades of physical work rather than privation. White hair. A face that had been deeply lined by the sun, and then lined further by the years that came after. He stood in his doorway and looked at Elias for a long time. Come in, he said finally. Wipe your boots. The cabin was one room, clean, organized with the careful order of someone who has learned to take care of what they have because what they have is exactly what it is and no more. A bed, made tight, a table with 2 chairs, which implied Domingo either had occasional visitors or had not been able to bring himself to remove the second chair. Ilya sat at the table. He took out Tomas's note, placed it on the table facing Domingo. The old man sat down across from him. He looked at the paper. He did not touch it for a long moment, just looked at it. Then he picked it up. His hands were not steady. He read it, he put it down. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Elias heard the fire settle, heard Flint adjust his position outside the door, heard the creek moving somewhere below the cabin under its skin of ice. He didn't run, Domingo said finally. No, Elias said. He didn't, I thought. He stopped. Other men said he ran. Couldn't face the loss. Went to California or Mexico. I told myself they were wrong. I told myself I knew my son. His voice was steady, but only because he was making it steady. He was 22. He was angry, he told me. He was going to find proof, and I told him not to be a fool. I told him Mercer was too powerful. He looked at Elias. He went anyway. He found the vault, Elias said. He got inside. He made a copy of the payroll ledger, a complete list of everyone owed wages with the amounts. He put it in a Bible and hid it inside the vault. Elias paused. Mercer's people caught him at the door. He was shot. He made it inside. He wrote the note before he died. Domingo looked at the table. He found proof, he said. He did. And then Mercer locked it in that mountain for 7 years. Yes, because Tomas had the map, Domingo said slowly, the map of the entrance. Tomas found the entrance following Mercer. He took the map off the papers. Mercer dropped when he stopped. There was a struggle. Mercer got away. Tomas got the map. I remember. Now, he told me he had something important. He didn't tell me what. He was quiet. He went back. He used the map to find the entrance. And then Mercer couldn't get back in, Elias said, without the map. Domingo absorbed this. 7 years, he said. 7 years. That silver sat in there. A long, long silence. How did you find it? Domingo asked. Without the map. Blizzard, Elias said. I was looking for shelter. I found the entrance by accident, he paused. Or by the way that things happen when they're meant to happen. I'm not sure which. Domingo looked at him. You're an engineer, he said. It wasn't a question. His eyes had gone to Elias's hands. The same way anyone who has worked in mines goes to the hands. Was, Elias said. Was, Domingo repeated. Nobody stops being an engineer. A pause. You opened the vault. I did. Then the silver is still there. Still there. I didn't take anything. I took the ledger and the Bible with Tomas's list. Domingo looked at his hands on the table. His own hands. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to tell me everything you know about what Mercer did in 1873, Elias said. I need the parts of this story that aren't in the ledger, the names, the people who might still be here and might still testify. He looked at the old man directly. And I need to know who else in this town I can trust. Domingo was quiet for a moment. Trust, he said, with the weight of a man who has not used that word lightly in 7 years. I know. Elias said, take your time. They talked until the light was gone. Domingo talked and Elias listened. And outside the winter dark came down on Harlan's Crossing, and the creek moved under its ice, and the stars came out over the Red Rock Ridge. And somewhere on that ridge a sealed vault sat in a mountain, waiting for what came next. The names Domingo gave him. 11 men, still in the area, former Copper Ridge workers scattered across the valley, some working other mines, some running small businesses. All of them carrying the same thing Domingo carried. The loss and the silence around the loss, and the bitterness of having that silence enforced by the man who had caused it in the first place. Because Mercer had not merely stolen from them, he had stayed. That was the cruelest part. He had stolen their wages, and then he had stayed in the same county, the same town, and built himself into the kind of man who organizes the Cattle Association, and sits on the town council and finances the doctor's practice, and makes himself so integral to the machinery of daily life that removing him would seem, to anyone who didn't know what he had done, like dismantling the town itself. That was the genius of it. And the horror, he came to see me once, Domingo said. 2 years after, 1875. He came to my door and he said he was sorry for the trouble with the mine, that the company accounts had been mismanaged by the previous ownership, that these things happen in volatile markets, that he personally had lost money too. He stopped. He looked right at me, Domingo said, stood right there, right where you're sitting, and said those words. A pause, did he know? Elias asked. That Tomas had gone after him? I don't know, Domingo said. I never knew if he had Tomas followed, if he knew, or if he thought Tomas ran and just came to tie up the loose ends. He looked at the door. Either way, he stood there, and I said nothing, because I had nothing. No proof, no body. Nothing but my son's word to me the night before he left, and a man's word from a dead boy means nothing against a banker. He looked at Elias. Now you have proof, he said. Now I have proof, Elias said, and I need to get it to someone with the authority to act on it. Not Hargrove. Domingo made a sound that was not quite a laugh. No, not Hargrove. Federal. Elias said. U.S. Deputy Marshal. Out of Denver, Seward Oaks? Domingo said immediately. He's been in the territory 3 years. He's honest. Old enough to have learned how to stay honest. A pause. The telegraph office. I know, Elias said. That's the next step. Mercer's brother-in-law runs the telegraph office. Domingo said. Elias stopped, thought about that. Of course he does, he said. He went back to town. He went back with a problem he had not fully anticipated, which was that the fastest route to federal authority was controlled by the man he was building a case against. Think. The telegraph office was out, or had to be treated as compromised. Any message he sent would likely be read before it left, or delayed, or simply not sent at all, with a polite assurance that it had been post. He could write a letter, but post from Harlan's Crossing went to Pueblo first, and from Pueblo to Denver, and the earliest a response could come back was 8 to 10 days. He did not have 8 to 10 days. He could feel the clock in this situation, could feel Mercer's awareness that something had changed. The minute a stranger started asking questions in a town this size, the town noticed, and the town reported. He needed to send the message himself, or rather, he needed someone to carry it. He thought about Domingo, an old man riding to Denver in December, alone, on a message he couldn't explain without giving the whole story, and arriving at the federal marshal's office to say what exactly? No. He thought about Price. Price was compromised. Price was also, possibly, looking for exactly the kind of concrete action that would let him stop carrying what he'd been carrying. But Price had the specific disadvantage of being a known quantity in Mercer's landscape. Price going to Denver would be noticed. Price's departure would be noted, and Mercer would know before Price reached the city limits. He lay on the hotel bed and looked at the ceiling and thought. Flint lay on the floor beside him and breathed. The ceiling offered nothing. He sat up. He wrote the message in the simplest, most factual terms he could manage. Not a letter. A telegraph message, short enough to be sent in 3 minutes, specific enough to require action. He put the location of the vault. He put Mercer's name. He put the federal statute reference for theft of wages. He knew it from a case in his engineering years, a mine dispute in '69 that had gone federal. He folded the paper. He went back to Price. The conversation was shorter this time. I need you to ride to Pueblo, Elias said, today. I need you to put this in the post from there. Not, from here. He put the sealed letter on the desk. And I need you to send a separate telegraph from Pueblo, direct to the federal marshal's office in Denver. This is the message. He put the folded paper beside the letter. Price looked at the papers. Mercer will know I left, Price said. Probably, Elias said. But he won't know why. Doctors travel, supply runs. Patient calls. He looked at Price directly. How far does Mercer's reach go toward Pueblo? Not far, Price admitted. His interests are here. He's never had reason to extend. Then ride to Pueblo, Elias said. Today, Price picked up the papers, looked at them, put them in his medical bag. Stood up. All right, Price said. That was all. Decisions, when they finally get made, don't need ceremony. Price would reach Pueblo in 2 days. The letter would reach Denver in 4. That was the slow road. Elias needed a faster one. He was back at the hotel by mid-afternoon. He had been careful. He had been patient. He had placed the evidence in the right channels. Federal channels, outside Hargrove's reach. Now he needed to wait. He did not like waiting, but it was the right move. Marshal Oaks in Denver, once he had the message, would respond. 2 days there, 1 day to mobilize, 2 days back. If the weather cooperated, 5 days, maybe 6. He needed to stay low, stay unremarkable. Let the machinery work. He lasted 4 hours, because Hargrove came to the hotel not alone, with a deputy, young, broad, the kind of deputy who is hired for size rather than judgment. Elias was in the common room when they came in. He saw them before they saw him, which gave him approximately 2 seconds to decide whether to move. He stayed where he was, because moving was worse. Moving was a signal. Hargrove found him, Mr. Cord, Hargrove said, pleasant. The pleasantness of someone who has decided this is going to be orderly because he is going to make it orderly. I'm going to need you to come with me. On what grounds? Elias said. Trespassing on private mineral claims, Hargrove said. The mine shaft you described is registered as a private claim. Entering without the owner's authorization is a violation of territorial mining law. The deputy had positioned himself to Elias's right. Who is the registered owner of the claim? Elias said. That's for the court to determine, Hargrove said, which meant the answer was Mercer. And Hargrove knew that admitting it directly would make the absurdity of the charge too visible. Elias looked at the deputy. Back at Hargrove, he stood. I'll walk, he said. You don't need to touch me. Appreciate that. Hargrove said with the pleasantness of a man who has gotten what he wanted and can afford to be agreeable about it. The jail was behind the sheriff's office. 3 cells, 2 empty. Elias went into the middle one, the lock engaged. Hargrove gave him back his pack, minus the canvas bag with the ledger, which was now apparently evidence, which meant they had the copies, not the originals. Elias had the originals under the hotel floorboard, which Hargrove didn't know. He sat on the bunk and looked at the ceiling of his cell and thought. The cell was a standard frontier construction, timber frame. Iron bars, good iron, well set, the kind that required either tools or keys or both. The lock was a quality mechanism, not a challenge to a man with skills, not impossible, but not trivial either. He noted the bolt points, the hinges, the gap between bar and frame at the bottom corner. He noted the deputy outside, who was reading something with the concentration of someone who did not read quickly or well, and who would not be paying attention to sounds a man makes when he is being very quiet about it. He thought about the tools in his pack. They had not gone through his pack thoroughly. Hargrove had taken the canvas bag and checked the obvious contents. No weapons, which was what they were looking for, and had not examined the bottom, where the engineering tools were wrapped in the spare shirt. He had a small pry bar, designed for leverage in confined spaces. 3 inches of quality steel. He thought about when. Not now. Not in daylight with the deputy alert and Hargrove possibly close. He needed to wait for the deputy to be less alert, which, given the reading, would not take long. But also, he needed to not simply break out and run. Running was the wrong move. Running gave Hargrove the narrative. Running made Elias the criminal, and Hargrove the lawman pursuing him, which was exactly the story Mercer wanted. He needed to break out. And then he needed to do something specific with the freedom before anyone noticed he had it. He lay back on the bunk. He thought about Mercer's face on the sidewalk that morning, the calculation behind the eyes, the speed of it. A man like that. A man who had managed what Mercer had managed, who had stayed in the same town for 7 years, while the people he had wronged lived within walking distance, who had built the church and the bank and the cattle association on top of wages he had never paid. That man did not make mistakes out of panic. He made calculated moves. This was a calculated move. Getting Elias into a cell took the pressure off for a few days. Bought time. Hargrove would claim the trespassing charge was routine, that evidence needed evaluation, that due process was being followed. It would hold until Oaks arrived, and then it would not hold at all. But by then, if Mercer was calculating correctly, Mercer would have had time to prepare his defense, which was the narrative. The mountain man who broke into private property. The vagrant with a grudge spinning a story about stolen wages and bodies in vaults based on a ledger he might have fabricated himself. The respected banker with 20 years of community investment on one side. The ghost from the ridge with nothing verifiable on the other, except the vault itself. Except the stenciling on the crates. Except the bones of Tomas Reyes and the note still folded in his cold, dead hand. Mercer couldn't get to any of that without the map. And the map had died with Tomas in 1873. Elias was the only person who knew where the vault was now. If something happened to Elias before Oakes arrived, he stopped that line of thinking. Not because it frightened him, because it was unproductive. If Mercer intended to make something happen to him, it would not happen in this cell with a deputy outside and a town watching. Too visible. Too implicating. And if Mercer tried to have him disappeared after a jail release, he would have to do it quickly and quietly, which was difficult in a town this size with a federal marshal already alerted. The math favored patience. His patience, not Mercer's. He lay back on the bunk. He thought. The telegraph office was compromised. But the telegraph office being compromised didn't mean the telegraph was. The machine itself was a machine. It did what it was told to do by whoever operated it. The operator left at 6 in the evening. He had seen the sign. The office sat unlocked for deliveries until 7. He had 1 hour in that window. He could operate a telegraph. It was not a complicated skill. He had learned it from Mine Communications in '72, when the company he was working for had run a line into the shaft for emergency signaling. He had learned it thoroughly because he had been underground when the equipment failed twice, and he did not intend to be dependent on someone's knowledge ever again. This was why you learned things thoroughly. For the moments when the person who was supposed to do it was compromised, he closed his eyes. He waited for dark. The deputy fell asleep at 9, not deep asleep. The light doze of a man who is supposed to be watchful and is not, which is its own kind of sleep, easy to startle out of, easy to drift back into. Elias worked slowly. The pry bar fit in the corner gap. The hinge was old. 3 years of Colorado winter had worked the screws loose in a way that normal maintenance would have caught, but apparently hadn't. He worked it the way he worked all seized mechanisms. Slow. Patient. Conversation rather than force. The hinge gave at 11:45. He held the bar, still, and listened. The deputy's breathing had not changed. He applied pressure to the bottom of the door, inward, counterintuitively, because a door that swings open on a freed hinge drops, and dropping makes noise, but pushing it inward first takes weight off the remaining hinge and lets the whole thing come free silently. He had worked in mines for 23 years. He knew how things come apart. The door came free. He set it against the wall, that took for 4 full minutes, and made no sound. He put on his coat, his pack. He stepped out. The deputy did not move. He went out the back. The telegraph office was dark. He had 1 candle from his pack. He set it behind the front counter, out of sight from the street window. The machine sat on the desk. He sat down in front of it. He had written the message 3 times in the cell, revising each time in his head, getting it shorter. A telegraph message is priced by the word. More importantly, a telegraph message that is discovered by the wrong person should give nothing away that wasn't already given. He sent it in under 4 minutes to Deputy Marshal S. Oakes Denver stop, Cole Harlan's crossing stop. Detained by local law stop. Vault secured Red Rock Ridge 14 miles. North stop evidence package sent via Price. Pueblo stop. Require federal presence immediately. Stop Mercer the man. Stop Reyes witness. Stop. He extinguished the candle. He went out the way he came in. He went back to the hotel. The back entrance. The stairs. No lights. Retrieved the originals from under the floorboard. Added them to the pack. He did not go back to the jail. He went to Domingo's cabin. Knocked twice. Paused. Knocked once. They had agreed on this at the end of their first conversation. When neither of them had known they would need it, the door opened. Domingo looked at him. They locked you up, Domingo said. Yes. You got out, yes. Come in, Domingo said. There's coffee and Elias Cord, mountain man, former engineer, widower. Accidental trespasser on a 7-year-old crime scene, sat down at Domingo Reyes's table and drank coffee. and waited for the machinery of actual law to arrive, which it would. He had made sure of that. Now, he just needed the town of Harlan's Crossing to not figure out where he was before Marshall Oaks got here. Flint was already inside, already asleep in front of Domingo's fire. Already, entirely comfortable in a way that the dog had no business being given the circumstances. Celius looked at the dog. The dog opened one eye, offered no apology. Right, Athiat said, and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Not because Elias was afraid, because he wasn't. And that absence of fear, that flat, settled calm, that had replaced what used to be a normal man's nervous system, told him something about what 6 years alone on a mountain does to a person that he was not entirely comfortable knowing. He should have been afraid. He was a fugitive from the local law, in a cabin at the edge of a town, controlled by the man he was trying to bring down, with no guarantee that the telegraph had gone through. No guarantee that Oaks would come in time. No guarantee of anything, eventually, except that Hargrove would find him, and that when Hargrove found him, it would be worse than the first time. And yet, he sat at Domingo's table and drank coffee that was too strong, and watched the fire and felt something that was closer to patience than it was to anything else. 6 years on a mountain changes the calibration of fear. He was aware of that. He didn't know yet if it was damage or wisdom. Flint made a small sound in his sleep, twitched one back leg. Chasing something, the fire crackled. Domingo had gone to bed, not because the situation permitted easy sleep, but because Domingo was 71 years old, and his body had learned to take rest when rest was possible, which was the wisdom of a man who had survived things by understanding his own limits. Elias sat alone and let himself think about Ruth, not the way he usually thought about her, sideways, protected. The glancing approach that let him carry her, without being flattened by her, directly this time, he thought about her face. The specific architecture of it. Not beautiful in the way that stopped people on the street, but the kind of face that gets better the more you know it. The kind of face that was different at 9 in the morning than it was at 9 in the evening. That held weather the way a landscape does, showed what was happening inside without performing it. He thought about Price's office. She came to me 2 weeks before you did. 2 weeks. Early symptoms. Treatable. She had gone alone. She had probably because she did not want to worry him. Probably because she was going to handle it herself. Probably because that was exactly the kind of person she was. Practical. Undemonstrative about her own needs in the way that certain people are when they have spent their whole lives taking care of things without requiring acknowledgement. She had gone alone, and Price had turned her away, and she had come home and not told him. And 2 weeks later, Elias had come home from a supply run to find her in a fever so advanced that the 3-day ride for the doctor was already, in retrospect, the act of a man who did not yet understand that he was arriving at the ending of something. He sat with that for a long time, not with anger. The anger had burned through him in the alley behind Price's office, clean and complete, and what was left was something harder and quieter grief. Maybe the specific grief of a man who has been carrying something for 6 years under the wrong label, calling it loss when part of it was injustice, calling it fate when part of it was a choice someone else made. Mercer's choice, Price's choice. The push to make medicine a tool of financial leverage in a frontier town where there was no alternative and no one to complain to. He had been grieving the wrong shape of thing, still the right thing to grieve, just larger than he had understood, and that somehow helped. Not because it made it better, nothing made it better, but because it made it legible. Because he could now understand what had happened to Ruth as something that had happened to her. Specifically, deliberately, because of decisions made by specific people, rather than as the random cruelty of a universe that takes without reason. There was a reason. His being here was the reason responding. He looked at the fire. I understand now, he said quietly. To the fire, to the room. To Ruth, who was nowhere and everywhere, and who he spoke to, sometimes in the spaces where no one else could hear. I understand why it matters to go down. The fire's nothing. But the cabin felt, somehow, less cold. He slept for 3 hours in the chair, not planning to, just. the body deciding on its own. The way bodies do when the adrenaline has done its work, and the thinking has done its work, and there is nothing left to do except wait. He woke to Domingo making breakfast. The old man moved around his small kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been the only occupant of a space for a long time and has learned to take up exactly the right amount of room. Not too much. Not so little that the space feels abandoned. Coffee, salt pork, hard biscuit. They ate without unnecessary words. Outside, the December morning was gray and windless. The kind of cold that does not announce itself loudly. Just settles, stays. Oaks, Domingo said after a while. 3 days minimum, Elias said. Maybe 5 if the weather's been bad between here and Denver. Hargrove will find you before that. Yes. Domingo looked at him across the table. What do you want me to do? Domingo said. Not what can I do. What do you want me to do? The distinction mattered. Elias thought about it honestly. I need you to be somewhere safe when this comes to a head, he said. Not because I don't want your help, because you're the only witness who was there in 1873. Your testimony is the living piece of this. The ledger is paper. Your voice is the thing that makes it real. He paused. If something happens to you before Oaks arrives, the case is weaker. Domingo absorbed this. You're asking me to stay hidden for a few more days. Yes. The old man looked out the window for a long moment. I have been hidden for 7 years, he said. A few more days is not the hardship you might think. I know, Elias said. I've been hidden for 6. Domingo looked at him. Something passed between them that did not require articulation. 2 men who had made the same mistake for different reasons after Domingo said. After Oaks comes and this is settled. After Elias said, we go up the mountain, you and me, and we bring Tomas home. Domingo set down his coffee cup, said nothing, but his eyes did something that Elias looked away from. Because a man's grief, when it finally finds a shape it can inhabit, is a private thing. Even when you're sitting 3 feet away from it, he spent the first day in Domingo's cabin. The second day, he moved, not far, not recklessly. But sitting still while the clock ran was a form of passivity that his engineer's mind could not endure indefinitely. He moved in the pre-dawn dark, when Harlan's Crossing was at its quietest. Through the alleys and back ways, he had memorized in his 2 days of walking the town. He needed to know the current shape of things. Hargrove would have found the empty cell by morning of the first day, would have understood that the telegraph had been used. White. Had been used. A man checking the office in the morning, the outgoing record, in the machine's own tape, which was standard equipment. Hargrove would know the message had gone, which meant Hargrove would have told Mercer. Which meant Mercer now knew that federal attention was coming. A man with Mercer's experience of navigating power did not stay still when federal attention was coming. He did one of 2 things. He ran, or he built a defense so robust that the federal attention found nothing actionable when it arrived. Mercer would not run. He had not run in 1873, when the crime was fresh and the risk was highest. He had stayed, had transformed himself into the foundation. A man like that, a man who had the psychological architecture to do that, did not run. He built defenses, and his best defense, Elias understood now, was the narrative. Elias was a fugitive from local law, a vagrant mountain man who had broken into a mine shaft, stolen documents, evaded arrest, and broken out of jail, who had sent a hysterical telegraph message to federal authorities based on a 7-year-old skeleton and some papers he claimed to have found. Against that, Mercer, the bank, the church, the cattle association, 20 years of being the foundation, the narrative on paper favored Mercer. Unless the evidence was unambiguous, and the evidence was unambiguous. But only if it reached Oaks intact, only if Oaks came. Only if the federal machinery was faster than Mercer's local machinery. Only if. He moved through the pre-dawn dark and watched Harlan's Crossing sleep and thought. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mercer came to Domingo's cabin, not Hargrove. Mercer himself, which said something. A man who sends other men for his problems is a man who believes his problems are manageable by proxy. A man who comes himself is a man who has decided the problem requires a different kind of management. Elias was not in the cabin, he was outside. He had been outside for an hour, moving carefully, in the tree line north of the cabin, watching the creek road, because on the third day, he had started watching the creek road in the mornings as a matter of habit. And because of that habit, he saw Mercer coming, Mercer on horseback, alone. No Hargrove, no deputy. Alone Fitch was. Interesting, Elias stayed in the trees. He watched Mercer dismount at Domingo's gate, watched him knock. Watched the door open. Domingo answering, because Domingo had no reason from the outside to know Mercer was coming. He could not hear the conversation. He watched. The body language said things that words would have said anyway. Mercer standing with the posture of a man who is being reasonable, who is extending an offer, who is doing someone a favor by coming in person. Domingo in the doorway with the posture of a man who has faced down every version of this particular encounter in his imagination for 7 years, and is now, in the real version, discovering that the imagination was not wrong. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Mercer reached into his coat. Elias went very still, but it was not a weapon, an envelope. Mercer handed Domingo an envelope, said something. Waited. Domingo looked at the envelope for a long moment, then looked at Mercer, said something. Mercer said something back. Domingo handed the envelope back. Mercer took it. His posture changed, barely, a fractional shift in the shoulders, but visible. The posture of a man who has tried the first approach and is now recalibrating for the second. He said one more thing, then he turned, mounted, rode back the way he'd come. Elias waited until Mercer was around the bend in the creek road. Then he came out of the trees. Domingo was standing in his doorway, still, looking at the road. What did he say? Elias said. Domingo turned. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has had a conversation he always knew was coming, and is now processing the reality of it. He offered me money, Domingo said. Enough to go somewhere else. Start again. He paused. He said the mine business was complicated, that there were circumstances I didn't understand, that the best thing for everyone, for the families of the workers, for the town, was to let it stay in the past, and I gave the envelope back. What did he say to that? Domingo's jaw tightened. He said that my son made a very unfortunate choice in 1873, and that he hoped I would make a wiser one. Silence. He knows Tomas is in the vault, Elias said. Yes, he's always known. Yes, Elias looked at the creek road. Mercer had just confirmed it. Not in a courtroom, not under oath, but confirmed it in the way that men confirm things when they think they are managing a situation rather than being witnessed. He turned to Domingo. Can you write? Elias said. Yes, I need you to write down exactly what he said, word for word, as close as you can remember. Right now, while it's fresh, date it, sign it. Domingo looked at him. That will be evidence, he said. Yes, Elias said. One more piece. On the 4th day, Oakes arrived not at dawn, not dramatically. In the mid-morning, riding in from the south, on a dark horse, with a spare horse behind him, and a deputy, who looked younger than he should have been for this kind of work. The federal marshal's badge caught the winter light as he passed the church. Elias saw them from the upper window of Domingo's cabin. He let out a breath he had been holding for 4 days. Then he went out to meet them. U.S. Deputy Marshal Seward Oakes was 54 years old and looked like a man who had been doing difficult things in difficult places for a long time and had reached the particular stillness that comes from no longer needing to prove anything. He had gray in his mustache and patient eyes, and he listened the way that rare people listen, not waiting for the pause that lets him speak, but actually receiving what you're saying and processing it and then responding to that, rather than to what he expected you to say. He looked at Elias in the road outside Domingo's cabin. You're the man who sent the telegraph, Oakes said. Yes, from a telegraph office you weren't authorized to use. The authorized operator has a financial relationship with the subject of my report, Elias said. Oakes looked at him for a moment. You're an engineer, Oakes said, and the mountain man story, both true, Elias said. Not incompatible. Something moved at the corner of Oakes's mouth. Not quite a smile. Show me what you have, Oakes said. They sat in Domingo's cabin for 2 hours. Elias laid out everything, in order, without embellishment. The way you present technical findings in a mining report. Facts, sequence, evidence, conclusion. Let the structure speak. The ledger. The Bible with Tomas's list. Tomas's note. Price's statement. He had written it out the night of their conversation and had Price sign it before the man rode for Pueblo. Domingo's written account of Mercer's visit that morning. His own written account of every event since the blizzard. Oakes read everything, carefully. Slowly, he asked 3 questions. The vault, it's still sealed? I closed the door. I didn't relock it. Anyone with physical access can open it. The remains of Tomas Reyes undisturbed? Undisturbed. You're certain the stenciling on the crates reads Harlan's Crossing Silver Works with a date of 1873? I'm an engineer who spent 23 years reading equipment markings underground, Elias said. Yes, I'm certain. Oakes closed the ledger. He looked at Domingo. You worked the Copper Ridge operation, Oakes said. From March 1873 to the day it closed, Domingo said. April 1st, 1873. I was a surface loader. I can tell you every man I worked with, what they did, and what they were owed. Can you identify Austin Mercer as the man who operated the Harlan's Crossing Silver Works? Domingo looked at Oakes directly. He came to my door this morning, Domingo said. I shook his hand when I gave him back his envelope. Same hand I shook in 1873 when I was told us the mine was closing. And our money was coming. He paused. I can identify him. Oakes was quiet for a moment. Mr. Reyes, he said. I understand your son's remains are in that vault. Yes, I want you to know that recovering him with full legal process is part of what happens next. He will receive a proper burial. His role in preserving the evidence will be part of the official record. A pause. His name will be in the record. Domingo said nothing for a moment. Then, thank you. Oakes stood. I'm going to the bank. He said he asked if Elias wanted to come. Elias thought about it. He thought about what he had said to himself in Domingo's cabin the first night. Anger is not the tool. Force is not the tool. Patience and evidence and the machinery of legitimate authority. Those were the tools. He had done his part. This next part was Oakes's. I'll be at the church. Elias said. Oakes raised an eyebrow. There's a cemetery, Elias said. My wife is buried there. Oakes nodded. No further questions. The man understood economy of words in both directions. The cemetery was on the eastern edge of town, small, frontier modest. The markers ranging from proper carved stone for the ones who could afford it to simple wooden crosses for the ones who couldn't, and some graves marked with nothing at all, except a slight depression in the ground that would have been invisible under last week's snow. He found her marker on the hill's upper slope. The stone was plain. He had not been there to choose anything elaborate, had asked the undertaker to do what was reasonable, and had paid for it before he left. The undertaker had done all right. Ruth Cord, 1840, 1874. Beloved, just that, he stood in front of it for a long time. The winter light was thin and clean. No wind. The kind of day where the cold is simply a condition of the air, not a force working against you. He could see a long way from this hillside. The town below. The creek road south. The ridge line of the Rockies to the north and west. And somewhere beyond his, in the distance, the particular shape of Red Rock Ridge where he had spent 6 years. I found it, he said. His voice was rough. Quiet. Just for her I found the whole thing. Who was behind it? Why Price turned you away? He paused. I know you didn't tell me you'd gone to him. I know why you didn't. You were handling it. You always handled things, he exhaled. I'm sorry I didn't handle this one faster. The wind moved barely. Across the hillside grass, poking up through the snow. There are 140 names in a ledger in my pack, he said. They're getting what they're owed. Not all of them are alive to get it. But their families are. The ones who are left, he looked at the stone. I thought you'd want to know that part. Specifically, he stood there a while longer, not speaking, not performing grief at the stone, just present, in the same place she was. As close as he was going to get, he thought about the 6 years on the mountain. He thought about what Tomas Reyes had done. A 22-year-old boy who had followed a powerful man into the mountains with nothing but certainty and a copy of the payroll records and had died for it. Who had spent his last hours writing a note so his father would not think he had run. Please tell him I tried. He had tried. And Elias had found the proof of his trying, and now it was going to matter. I think I'm done hiding, he said quietly to the stone. I think it's time. He put his hand on the top of the stone, cold. Just stone. Just the fact of it, but the gesture helped anyway. Helped in the irrational, necessary way that such gestures help when the person you are addressing is beyond the reach of anything rational. He took his hand away, turned around, and walked back down the hill toward town. When he came back down Main Street, Harlan's Crossing had that specific quiet a town gets when everyone has heard something, but nobody knows the whole of it yet. People on the sidewalks, groups of 2 and 3, speaking quietly. Looking at the bank, Hargrove's deputy, the young broad one, was standing outside the jail with an expression of complete confusion and no clear orders. He was alone, which meant Hargrove was inside the bank. Oakes's horse was tied at the front rail. His deputy's horse beside it. Elias went in. The bank's main floor was a single large room, teller windows on the right, a manager's desk in the center. At the back, a door, partially open, leading to the office that Mercer used as his own. The door was not the point. The point was the room, because the room held Oakes, standing with that federal stillness that fills a space, not through size but through authority. His deputy beside him. Hargrove in the corner, stripped of whatever he'd believed his morning held, visibly recalibrating, and 2 bank clerks pressed against the teller windows like they hoped the wall would absorb them, and Mercer, behind the manager's desk, 62 years old, silver-haired, sitting very still in the chair that was his chair in the bank, that was his bank in the town that he had built. Looking at Oakes with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in rooms like this one, managing rooms like this one, and who is now determining which of his considerable skills applies to this particular version. He saw Elias come in. Something moved in his face, not fear. Mercer was past the fear of individuals. What moved there was recognition, the specific recognition of a man who has finally identified the variable that disrupted his calculations, the mountain man. The engineer who could read terrain and open locks and work telegraph machines. The man who had stumbled into his vault during a blizzard, and had then, instead of being convenient, been inconvenient in every possible way. Mr. Cord, Mercer said. Mercer, Elias said, and that was the only personal exchange they would ever have. Because Oakes stepped forward, Augustin Mercer, Oakes said. I'm placing you under federal jurisdiction pending charges, including theft of wages, destruction of employment records, and complicity in the death of Tomas Reyes. You are entitled to engage legal representation. You will accompany me to Denver, he paused. Do you understand? Mercer looked at Oakes. Then he looked at the room. The clerks, Hargrove in the corner. Then he looked at his desk, his bank, his office door. Something in him, some calculation, some assessment of variables, completed itself. On what evidence? Mercer said. Quiet. Controlled Oakes put the ledger on the desk. Mercer looked at it without touching it. A payroll ledger, Mercer said. From a mine operation that was closed due to financial difficulty, found in the vault that you built, Oakes said, along with the silver that was never paid out, and the remains of a man whose name appears in the employment records as a surface worker, and who followed you to that vault in November of 1873, and who was shot at the entrance, a beat, and who survived long enough to make a written statement, Oakes said, which is in federal custody. Something shifted in Mercer's expression. Not much, a fractional thing. The kind of shift that happens in a man's face when he has been running a calculation for 7 years, and the calculation has just returned a result he did not anticipate. He had assumed Tomas was dead at the door. He had assumed Tomas had not made it inside. He had assumed for 7 years without verification, because going back to verify would have required returning to the vault, which he could not do without the map. That there was no testimony. He had been wrong. I'd like to speak with my attorney, Mercer said. You'll have that opportunity in Denver, Oakes said. Stand up, please. Hargrove tried to object. It was the attempt of a man who has suddenly understood that the structure he built his position inside is falling, and who does not yet know whether he can outrun it. He said something about local jurisdiction. Oakes looked at him for 3 seconds. "Deputy," Oakes said to his own man. His deputy produced a second document, federal warrant, Hargrove's name on it, because Price's statement had mentioned Hargrove specifically. Had mentioned a conversation in 1873 in which Hargrove had delivered Mercer's instructions to Price about which patients to turn away. Had mentioned, with the specific clarity of a man who has been waiting 6 years to say it clearly, that Hargrove had been in the room. Hargrove looked at the warrant. He looked at Oakes, he looked at Elias, and his shoulders did the thing they did. The thing that happens when a large certain man encounters a situation that is larger and more certain than he is. He sat down, he did not get up again under his own authority. The arrest of Augustine Mercer and Clem Hargrove took 40 minutes from the moment Oakes entered the bank. Word moved through Harlan's Crossing, the way word moves in small towns, faster than any single person could carry it, slower than the thing itself. By the time Mercer was being walked to Oakes's horses, the sidewalks were lined, silent, mostly. The silence of people watching something they thought permanent turn out not to be. A few faces Elias recognized. He recognized them from Domingo's description, former Copper Ridge workers, scattered through this town's daily life. The man who ran the feed store had been an underground drill operator in '73. The woman at the laundry, her husband had been a surface loader, had died the following year of causes that had never been officially attributed to anything, but that Domingo described as a man who simply stopped being able to go on. They stood on the sidewalks, and they watched Mercer walk past in federal custody, and none of them said anything, because some things are too large for words at the moment of their happening. Words come later, when the size of the thing has been processed enough to fit in a sentence. In the moment itself, there is just the silence of people who have been carrying something for a very long time and have just felt it begin to lift. Elias stood on the sidewalk and watched. He was not triumphant. That surprised him. He had thought he might feel triumphant, but what he felt was quieter than that, more settled. The feeling of a thing that was wrong being made less wrong. Not entirely right, never entirely right. Because Tomas was still dead, and Ruth was still dead. And 7 years of injustice does not unhappen because the man behind it is finally in handcuffs. But less wrong was something. Less wrong was, in fact, a great deal. Oakes came to find him before they left for Denver. The two of them stood on the sidewalk in the winter light, watching the last arrangements being made. "The vault," Oakes said. "I'll need you to take us up there before winter makes it impossible." "Tomorrow," Elias said. "Weather's holding. We can go tomorrow." "You and Domingo Reyes both?" "Yes." Oakes looked at him. "You understand that your actions, specifically breaking out of Hargrove's jail and using the telegraph without authorization, are technically violations of territorial law?" "Yes," Elias said. "The circumstances provide substantial mitigation," Oakes said. "Hargrove's arrest on federal charges functionally invalidates his authority in the matter of your detention. The telegraph use was creative, but in service of legitimate federal reporting." He paused. "I'm not inclined to pursue it, I appreciate that," Elias said. "Don't do it again," Oakes said. "I don't plan to make a habit of breaking out of jails." Elias said. "See that you don't," Oakes said. And something in his voice suggested that the instruction was mildly humorous, and that he knew it was mildly humorous, which was as close as Seward Oakes seemed to get to levity. He extended his hand. Elias shook it. "You did good work, Cord," Oakes said. "Even the parts you weren't supposed to do." They went up the mountain the next morning, 3 of them. Elias on Sable. Domingo on a horse Oakes had left for the purpose. Oakes's deputy, whose name turned out to be Harlan Fitch, which he was clearly used to having to explain given the town name, on his own mount, Anne Flint, who had very strong opinions about being left behind and expressed them with enough conviction that Elias had stopped arguing. The trail was steep in the aftermath of the blizzard. The snow consolidated enough to bear the horses in most places, soft in the south-facing sections, where the previous day's thin sun had worked on it. They picked their way carefully. Elias in front, reading the terrain the way he had learned to read it over 6 years of going up and down. Domingo rode in the middle and did not speak. He had barely spoken since Elias had told him they were going up. This was right, Elias thought. Some journeys don't need narration. They just need to be made. The cliff face appeared in the mid-morning. Elias dismounted and tied Sable. He moved along the base of the rock, letting his hand trail the surface the way it had in the blizzard, and felt the gap before he saw it. He turned to the others. Here, he said. He went in first. Then Fitch. Then Domingo. The cave received them the way caves receive people who come in from the cold. The wind, gone, the temperature still cold, but the quality of cold different, endurable. Elias lit the lantern he had brought. The ice formations on the walls caught the light and sent it back changed. Domingo stopped. He looked around the first door chamber. The tool marks on the walls, the fragments of old equipment, the evidence of a mine that had been built and worked, and then deliberately sealed from the world. His son had found this place. His son had died in this place. He stood in it and breathed. Elias did not rush him. Fitch, to his credit, also did not rush him. They simply stood, all of them, in the first chamber, for as long as Domingo needed to stand there, which was several minutes. Then Domingo nodded, and they went forward. The vault door was exactly as Elias had left it, closed. The wheel mechanism frosted over again, from the days since he had worked it clear. He chipped it quickly, faster this time, knowing the task, the ice not as thick as the decades of accumulation he had faced the first time. He opened the door, the room beyond, the strong boxes, the pallets, the accumulated wealth of a crime that had compounded silently in the dark for 7 years. Fitch made a sound low in his throat. Elias watched Domingo. The old man walked forward slowly. He moved between the strong boxes without touching them, not looking at the silver, looking at the room itself. Trying to understand, perhaps, how a person dies in a space this size. How a 22-year-old boy with a bullet wound had lasted 8 days in here. Writing, waiting. He stopped at the back corner. He looked down at what remained of Tomas Reyes. For a long time, none of them spoke. The lantern light held steady in the still underground air. Then Domingo crouched down. Slowly, his knees making the complaints of a 71-year-old body, asked to kneel. He lowered himself until he was eye level with the near-flat sleeping roll. He put his hand on what had been his son's shoulder, just held it there. Elias looked away, gave the man the only privacy that was available to give. His gaze withheld. He heard Domingo say something in Spanish. Very quietly, just a few words. He did not speak Spanish well enough to catch them. It didn't matter. The meaning was legible without words. I found you. I'm here. You didn't run. They were in the vault for 2 hours. Fitch documented everything with the thoroughness that federal record-keeping required. He counted the strong boxes, inventoried the visible contents, made a physical description of the room for the legal record. He was efficient and respectful, and gave Domingo space throughout. Before they left, Elias went to the corner where Tomas lay. He had brought something from Harlan's Crossing, a canvas shroud. Plain, adequate. Dignity was not about elaborateness. It was about intention. He wrapped what remained of Tomas Reyes with the same care he would have given to anything that mattered. Domingo watched. When it was done, they carried Tomas out together, not in pieces, not roughly, not as evidence. As a person, as the son of the man who walked beside them, they carried him out into the winter light. Tomas Reyes was buried in the Harlan's Crossing Cemetery 3 days later, on the hill's eastern slope, not far from Ruth. The service was small. Domingo, Elias, Oakes, who had returned from Denver for it, a fact that said something about what kind of man Oakes was. Mrs. Foss from the general store, who had known Domingo slightly and had shown up without explanation, which was its own kind of grace. And 11 men, former Copper Ridge workers, every one of them, who was still in the valley, who came without being asked. They simply came. Because word had gotten to them, the way word gets to people in small communities that still function as communities. And because they understood without being told that Tomas Reyes had died for something that had also been done to them, and that the least they could do was stand at the graveside. The preachers said the right words. Domingo stood at the head of the grave and did not cry. He had the stillness of a man who has done his crying in private and has now arrived at the part that is about bearing witness rather than releasing grief, after the 11 men came to him one by one. Not to say elaborate things, just to shake his hand, to say the man's name, Tomas Reyes, out loud. So it was spoken in air and not just thought. So it was real in the way that names become real when enough people speak them. Elias stood back and watched. He thought about 140 names in a ledger, 140 entries. Hours worked, wages owed, the patient recording of labor that had never been compensated. And now, slowly, through the machinery that Oakes had set in motion, through the federal process that would take months but would happen, those names would become compensations, restitution. Not enough, never enough, but something. Something with their names attached to it, which was what justice looked like when it arrived after years of nothing. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just real. When the service was over, and the men had gone, and Domingo stood alone at the grave for a few minutes, that Elias gave him by walking a short distance away, Elias found himself looking at the stone marker someone had already placed. It was plain. Simple painted wood, for now. The permanent stone would come later. Tomas Reyes, 1851, 1873. He did not run. Someone had known. Or Domingo had told someone. Or the story had moved through the town the way stories move, and someone with a paintbrush had made a decision. Those last 4 words. He did not run. Elias stood and looked at them for a long moment. He thought about a 22-year-old boy who had followed a man into the mountains with nothing but certainty and a piece of paper, who had died in the dark with a bullet in him and 8 days' worth of cold slowing the dying, who had written what he needed to write before the writing became impossible, and had folded the paper inside a Bible in a place his killer would never think to look. He did not run. He had not. And standing there at the edge of a cemetery in December in a frontier town, Elias understood something that he had been approaching from different directions. For several days now, Tomas Reyes had been afraid. He would have had to be. He was 22 years old, following a powerful man into the mountains in November, knowing the risk, knowing Mercer would not welcome him. He had been afraid and he had gone anyway. Elias had been afraid of considerably less, of people, of conversation, of the ordinary friction of being present in the world, and had spent 6 years on a mountain avoiding it. That was not the same kind of courage as Tomas's. He was not going to claim it was. But the direction of travel was the same. Down. Toward the thing that needed doing, he turned away from the grave. He went to stand with Domingo for a moment, not speaking, just present. Then they walked down the hill together toward the town that was, improbably, beginning to feel like something Elias had a stake in. The smithy was in worse shape than Mrs. Foss had implied, which was to say, it was standing, which was more than could be said of the roof over the forge, which had partially collapsed sometime in the previous winter, and had not been repaired because there was no one to repair it. The anvil was still there. The bellows had mice in it. The tool wall was missing half its hooks, but what remained was quality iron. And quality iron lasts. Elias stood in the middle of the space and looked around. His engineer's mind did what it always did, assessed, calculated, made a list in order of priority. The roof was first. Everything else was cosmetic until the roof was right. He could fix the roof himself with 3 days of work and the right lumber, and the lumber yard was on the south end of Main Street. The bellows would need replacing. He knew how to build a bellows, had built one from scratch in a mine shaft in '72 when the original failed and the nearest supply was 2 weeks' travel. The tools on the wall were workable. The hooks could be replaced. The anvil was. He crossed to it, put both hands on it, tested its seating on the block, collared. He had always loved a solid anvil. It was the one piece of equipment in a smithy that you could not substitute, could not improvise, could not make do without. Everything else in the craft was negotiable. The anvil was the anvil, and this one was good iron, well seated, still true on the face. He stood with his hands on it for a moment. He thought about the 23 years he had spent as an engineer, the mine work, the assessments and the explosions and the darkness, and the equipment failures and the 23 years of solving problems in confined spaces under pressure. And the years before that, as a young man in a smithy in Pennsylvania, learning what metal was, learning how it behaved under heat, how it wanted to move in certain directions and resisted in others. How you could not make metal do something it was not designed to do, but how, if you understood it, you could make it do exactly what you needed. He had been happier then, he thought. Not because the work was easier. It wasn't. But because it was honest work. Because you put effort in, and you got something real out, and the connection between the two things was visible. You struck the metal, and the metal changed. The change was right there, immediate. True, he had stopped trusting things that were right there. Immediate, true, he would try again. He was fixing the first section of roof 3 days later, when Domingo came. The old man stood at the smithy's open wall. He had taken out 2 sections of the damaged wall to get light and air while he worked, and watched him for a while before speaking. "You're staying." Domingo said yes. "The mountain?" Elias drove a nail. Straight, clean. "The mountain will manage without." "Me you managed without the mountain," Domingo said. "For the first few years, barely," Elias said. Domingo was quiet for a moment. "I went up," he said, "yesterday, just to the lower slope. I wanted to see the trail." Elias looked down from the roof. "And?" "It's a hard country," Domingo said. "Yes, it's also very beautiful." "Yes," Elias said. "It is." Domingo looked at the smithy. The work Elias had done in 3 days. The new timber on the south wall. The patched roof section. The swept floor. "What will you make first?" he said. Elias thought about it. "Hinges," he said. "The town has a shortage of good hinges." I noticed. Domingo made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was the first time Elias had heard him make a sound like that. "Hinges," Domingo said. "Hinges," Elias said. "Everything needs to open and close properly. You'd be surprised how many problems trace back to a bad hinge." He went back to the roof. Domingo stood in the open wall a while longer, looking at the work. Then he said, "My wife used to make bread on Sundays, before she died." Before any of this, he said it simply, not performing the grief, just placing it in the room. Elias stopped working. "Mine too," he said, a long pause. The sound of the town going about its life around them. Wagon wheels on the frozen street. A dog somewhere, barking at something important. The thin Colorado winter light coming in flat and clean through the open wall. "We were lucky men," Domingo said. Elias thought about that. "Yes," he said, "we were." Winter turned. Harlan's Crossing went on being a town. 3 months later, the first restitution payments went out. Not all of them. The legal process was what it was, and what it was slow. But the preliminary distribution reached the families in the valley first, the ones who were still there. The ones who had stayed in Harlan's Crossing or in the surrounding county because there was nowhere else to go, or because leaving would have felt like admitting that Mercer had won, or because they simply belonged to this piece of ground. Elias was at the smithy when Domingo came to tell him he had been working the bellows, the new bellows, which he had built in January, from cowhide and good ash wood, and which worked better than the original. And the forge was hot, and the iron in the fire was moving toward the right color, and he almost did not hear the knock at the open door, over the sound of the work. He looked up, Domingo. A different Domingo from the one who had opened a cabin door 3 months ago, with the wariness of a man who has spent 7 years waiting for the thing that finally arrived. This Domingo was still old, still thin, still carrying everything he had carried. But the way he carried it was different. "They started paying out," Domingo said. Elias set down the tongs. "How much?" "My portion was $112, Domingo said. "Plus interest calculated on 7 years, Elias nodded. "Tomas would have received 86, Domingo said. "They're giving it to me, as his father." Silence. What will you do with it? Elias said. Domingo thought about this for a moment. Genuinely thought. I'm going to fix my fence, he said. It's been falling over for 4 years. A pause. And I'm going to buy a good coat. Before next winter, Elias smiled. Not a big smile. Not a performed smile. The kind that comes on its own when something is exactly right. The fence first, Elias said. Then the coat. That's what I thought, Domingo said. He turned to go. Then stopped. There is something else, he said. Without turning back, yes? The men. The ones who came to Tomas's burial. 3 of them have asked about you. Whether you're staying. Whether the smithy will be open. It will be open. Elias said, they want to know if you'll take apprentices. He had not thought about this. He thought about it now. For a moment, how old? He said. Youngest is 19, Domingo said. Grandson of one of the men from the mine. His grandfather never got to teach him a trade. Elias looked at the smithy, the anvil, the forge, the new bellows he had built. He thought about 23 years of knowing how things worked and what they were made of, and how you made them do what needed doing. He thought about a 19-year-old boy with a grandfather who died before he could pass anything on. Tell them yes, Elias said. That was in the afternoon. By evening, the forge was banked, and the tools were hung, and the work was done for the day. And Elias did what he had started to do occasionally. He went up the hill. The evening was cold and still. The sky in the west holding the last of the light in bands of orange and deep blue. The way Colorado sky does at the end of a clear winter day, when you can see all the way to the edge of the world. He stood at Ruth's marker. The smithy's open, he said. I'm taking apprentices. One of them is the grandson of a man named Cardillo. He was at the mine the same year you got sick. You might have known him. He looked at the stone. His grandfather worked 3 years for wages he never saw and died without passing anything on. He paused. I'm going to pass something on, he said. In his name. In the name of all of them, I suppose. But specifically in his. A pause. You'd have liked that. The specificity of it. You always said the specific things were what made generosity real. That doing something for everyone was easy. Doing it for one person, for a reason, was the thing that counted. The light was going now, orange fading to the deep blue-purple that comes just before stars. Domingo and I are going to Pueblo in the spring, he said. There are workers from the mine who moved there after '73. Their names are in the ledger. They need to be told in person that what's theirs is coming. That somebody found the proof. He paused. That Tomas Ratius didn't run. He was quiet for a moment. The first star appeared. South, over the distant ridge. I'm all right, he said. I don't mean that the way I used to mean it when it was just something to say. I mean, he stopped, found the words. I mean, I know the difference now between being all right and being numb. And I know which one I was on that mountain for 6 years, he breathed. I'm not numb, he said. I miss you. That's not going away. I'm not asking it to. He looked at her name carved in the stone. Ruth. But I'm here. In the world. A pause. Fixing hinges, mostly. And teaching a 19-year-old boy how not to lose a finger on the tongs, which is a more urgent problem than it sounds. He almost smiled. Did smile. I'll come back, he said. I'll always come back. He put his hand on the top of the stone. Cold. Just stone. But the gesture was its own kind of language, and he had stopped being embarrassed by it. Then he turned and walked back down the hill. The smithy was lit when he returned. Not his doing. He had banked the forge before leaving, as always. But the lantern in the window was burning, which meant someone had lit it. He went to the door. Domingo was inside. Sitting at the workbench along the south wall, in the chair that Elias had put there for his own use, looking at the tools on the wall with the expression of a man with no particular agenda, who is simply in a comfortable place. He had a coffee pot from somewhere. Own cabin, probably. 2 cups. He looked at Elias in the doorway. I thought you might want coffee, Domingo said. I do, Elias said. He came in. They sat at the workbench with coffee in December, in a smithy in Harlan's Crossing, Colorado territory. With the forge cooling and the stars coming out over the Red Rock Ridge, the town going about its evening around them, they did not speak for a while, because some things are said well enough in other ways. The forge ticked as it cooled. Flint was asleep by the banked fire, taking up more room than a dog of his size had any right to, entirely unbothered by the indecency of his own comfort. Outside, the creek was running somewhere under its winter ice. The mountains were dark against the darker sky, and somewhere on the ridge, sealed, silent, empty now, the silver moved to federal custody, and the bones of Tomas Reyes resting in proper ground. A cave sat in the rock, no longer holding anything that should not have been held, just a cave now. The mountain didn't know the difference, but the people in the valley did, and that, Elias had come to understand, was the only difference that had ever mattered. He thought about that as he sat with his coffee. The mountain's indifference had seemed for 6 years like a kind of permission. Nobody up there to require anything of him. Nobody to notice his presence or his absence. Nobody to ask. Nobody to answer. He had called that peace. He understood now that he had been confusing the absence of demands with the presence of meaning. They were not the same thing. Not remotely. The mountain did not care. That was not permission. It was just geology. What gave a life its shape, what made it recognizable as a life rather than a duration, was the choosing. The going toward rather than the going away. Ruth had known this. She had tried, in that quiet way of hers, to tell him. Not in words. In the way she moved through the world, always tilted toward things rather than away from them. Even in the last 2 weeks of her life, when she was already sick and already choosing not to tell him, she had been managing things rather than retreating from them. She had handled it, the way she handled everything. He had not understood what that cost her. He understood it now. Better late than never was a thing people said, and it was true as far as it went. But it did not go all the way. Sometimes late was very late. Sometimes late was 6 years, and a dead boy in a vault, and an old man who had spent 7 winters not knowing. Late was something. Late was still better than never. He would take late. He would work with late. He would make it mean something, by the uses he put to the time remaining. Tomorrow there was a roof section to finish, and a first meeting with the apprentices. He had sent word, and they were coming at 8, and he had not taught anyone anything in a long time and was mildly concerned about whether he remembered how. Teaching required you to make explicit the things that had become automatic, and that was a particular kind of difficulty. You had to go back to the beginning. You had to remember that the beginning existed, he thought. He could do that, in fact, that it might be exactly what he needed, to go back to the beginning. To remember that things could be learned. That he himself had once not known any of this. That the 23 years of knowledge in his hands had arrived there incrementally, learned from other men who had not been born knowing it either. He had a 19-year-old boy who needed a trade his grandfather had died before passing on. That was something he could give. That was something no one could take back. Same time tomorrow? Domingo said. Yes, Elias said. Good. They drank their coffee. The night settled in around them, quiet and cold and full of whatever came next. Which was, for the first time in a long time, not nothing. Which was, for the first time in a long time, enough.